By Saturday, Sophie had sorted the letters into 3 piles. The first pile she privately labelled possible. These were letters from people with genuine-sounding problems that might actually involve magic. The stump-end farmer with his rearranging field. A woman in upper folding whose bees had started producing honey in the shape of small architectural models. A schoolteacher in Port Haven who reported that the town's public well had begun singing at dawn and refused to stop until someone complimented it. Strange, but not impossible, and more to the point, not dangerous. Probably. The second pile was unlikely. These included a lengthy petition from the Sentient Pudding Cooperative, requesting formal recognition as a guild, 3 separate letters asking if starlight orchids could cure various ailments, baldness, gout, and a persistent melancholy that sounded to Sophie like the writer simply didn't like Mondays, and a note from someone who wanted to know if the castle gave tours. The third pile was completely mad, and it was by far the tallest. "You've been at those since 6 o'clock, Calcifer said from the hearth. He was burning in shades of blue and irritable orange this morning, which meant the pipes had been at him again. "You're going to answer them, aren't you?" "I'm sorting them," Sophie said. "That's not the same as answering them. It's the first step toward answering them. You're Sophie. I know how this works. First you sort, then you organize, then you worry about the ones you haven't organized. Then you do the thing you were always going to do in the first place and pretend you just made up your mind." He flickered. "It would save time if you skipped to the end." "Be quiet," Sophie said, but without heat, because he was right, and they both knew it. The castle was still being difficult. This morning the stairs from the bedroom had deposited Sophie in the conservatory instead of the kitchen, which had required her to walk past the starlight orchids, blooming excessively, throwing off sparks of white light that popped against her dressing gown like tiny fireworks, and through the bathroom, which was humming again. Not the starlight orchid melody from last week. Something new. Something that sounded, Sophie thought irritably, like a sea shanty being performed by plumbing that had never seen the sea. When she'd finally reached the kitchen, the table was 6 inches further from the wall than it had been the night before, and the broom cupboard had rearranged itself so that all the brooms were upside down. Morgan thought this was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Midnight was sleeping on top of the broom cupboard in a vast purple sprawl, radiating the serene unconcern of a cat who has never been bothered by anything in her life and has no intention of starting now. "The castle moved the table again," Sophie said to Calcifer. "I know. It moved the table, it moved the brooms, and sometime around 3 in the morning it tried to move the hearth. My hearth. I told it if it tried that again, I would heat the flagstones until they cracked." "Did it listen?" "It made a noise like a door slamming and moved the brooms instead." Sophie frowned at the ceiling. The castle had been getting worse all week, and she couldn't work out why. It wasn't the time paradoxes. Those had mostly settled into a kind of low-grade background strangeness, like a hum you stopped hearing after the first hour. It wasn't the Puddings, who had established their cooperative bakery with remarkable efficiency and were currently engaged in a complicated trade agreement with Martha's shop involving flour futures and cream-sharing protocols that Sophie had wisely decided not to investigate. The castle's mood felt personal, targeted, as though it was cross about something specific and wanted Sophie to notice without actually having to say what. "It started after the cottage arrived," Calcifer said, reading her expression with the ease of long acquaintance. "Just so you know." "That's ridiculous. The castle can't be—" Sophie stopped herself. She had been about to say jealous, and the word sat in her mouth like a stone. "Never mind. I'm going to Stump End." "You're what?" "Stump End, the farmer with the rearranging field." She picked up the letter from the possible pile. It was written in careful, slightly uneven handwriting on paper that smelled faintly of sheep. "Dear Castle," it began, which Sophie found oddly endearing. "My name is Amos Cotter, and I farm 40 acres at Stump End, which is east of Market Chipping, if you follow the Port Haven road and turn right at the horse trough. I have a problem. My field has been rearranging itself of a night time. I am not mad. My wife thinks I should write to you because she thinks there is a sensible explanation and a wizard would know it. I do not think there is a sensible explanation. I think something has gone wrong with the ground and I do not know who else to ask." "He sounds embarrassed," Calcifer observed. "He sounds like a man who's never asked anyone for help in his life and is furious about having to start now." Sophie folded the letter. "I want to see this field. If it's another case of dormant magic and like the cottage, then it's a pattern, Calcifer. The Christmas overflow woke up Edith Bell's house. If it woke up something else, somewhere else, then there could be dozens, hundreds. And you want to fix all of them personally. I want to see one, personally, today. Are you coming?" Calcifer's flames went very still, which was the fire demon equivalent of a double take. "Coming? I can't come. I'm in the hearth. I'm always in the hearth. That's what hearths are for." "Michael's portable hearth spell," Sophie said. "You used it at Christmas." "That was an emergency. That was saving the world from an angry elemental and 3 centuries of backed-up holiday cheer. This is a field. You'd get to go outside." She said it simply, without emphasis, the way she said things when she meant them most. Calcifer's flames shifted, blue to green to something paler, harder to name. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was carefully offhand. "How far is it?" 2 hours walk, maybe less. You'd have an hour in the spell before you'd need to be back." "An hour." He considered this. His flames rippled. "I'd need the ball." "I know where Michael left it. And I'm not being carried like a lantern. I want a proper grip, both hands. If you drop me in a ditch..." "I'm not going to drop you in a ditch." "You say that now." But he was already shifting in the grate, compacting himself into a tighter, more portable flame. And Sophie could see the flicker of something behind his sardonic facade that was too quick and too bright to be anything as simple as excitement. She left him to prepare himself and went out the front door, which opened onto market chipping without protest for once, though the doorknob turned with a grudging stiffness that bordered on rude, to check on Keeper's cottage. The cottage had been there 5 days now, and Tamsin Bell had done what any self-respecting bookkeeper would do with an enchanted house full of her dead grandmother's magic. She had organized it. There was a schedule pinned to the wall beside the front door, written in neat copperplate on lined paper. Keeper's cottage. Community bookings, it read, followed by a grid of days and times. Tuesday evenings were marked committee dinner, Sophie H. Thursday mornings said scone workshop, Mrs. Fairfax. Saturdays read open house, all welcome. Someone, sage by the look of the handwriting, which was beautiful and slightly inhuman, had penciled in Foundation Ethics Discussion Group. Next to Friday afternoon, followed by 3 hopeful question marks and a tiny drawing of a root system. "I told it the discussion group needs at least 5 confirmed attendees before I'll book it," Tamsin said, appearing in the doorway with a mug of tea and a ledger tucked under her arm. She looked better than she had 5 days ago, still thin, still sharp, still holding herself with the rigid uprightness of someone who trusted columns more than feelings. But the bruised look had faded, and there was colour in her face that hadn't been there before. "Morning," Sophie said. "How's the cottage?" Opinionated. It rearranged the crockery shelf this morning because I'd put the bowls in a different order from Gran's. I moved them back. We've reached an understanding. She sipped her tea. The roses, on the other hand, have reached nothing of the sort. Sophie looked at the front garden. The Witch of the Wast's rose cuttings had arrived on Thursday in a small wooden crate carried by one of the witch's sentient carrots, which had wheeled up to the cottage gate in a miniature wheelbarrow, deposited the crate with an air of labour solidarity, and departed with a small orange salute. The cuttings had been in the ground less than 48 hours and were already climbing the south wall with visible ambition, their thorns hooked into the mortar like crampons. "I moved them to the north wall yesterday," Tamsin said. They moved themselves back overnight. I moved them again this morning. They're now on the east wall, which I didn't agree to, but at least they're not strangling the door frame. The witch's roses are spirited. The witch's roses tried to eat a sparrow. Tamsin's voice was flat and dry, and Sophie was delighted to notice, genuinely amused beneath the flatness. I hit the largest one with a trowel. It sulked for an hour and then started climbing again. I've put them on a watering schedule. If they behave, they get compost. If they don't, they get vinegar. That's very... Sophie caught herself before saying practical. Sensible. It's bookkeeping, incentive structures. Tamsin leaned against the door frame. The cottage behind her was warm and tidy and smelled of the bread it had apparently baked itself that morning. A sourdough from the scent, tangy and brown and exactly right. Where are you off to? You've got your walking boots on. Stump End. There's a farmer with a rearranging field. I want to see if it's... Sophie hesitated, looking for the right word. Connected. To Gran, Tamsin said, not a question. To what happened with the cottage, to the Christmas magic stirring things up. Sophie met her eyes. If there are two cases, Tamsin, it's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. Tamsin was quiet for a moment, staring into her tea with the focused expression of someone adding up a column that kept producing an impossible total. How many more do you think there could be? I don't know. That's what I want to find out. Right. Tamsin straightened. Well, I've got 3 community bookings to set up and a rose to negotiate with. But when you come back... She stopped, started again, more carefully. I'd like to hear what you find, if it is a pattern. Because if Gran was... Another stop. She took a breath and finished in the brisk tone of someone filing an observation under the correct heading. I'd like to understand what she was, better than I do now. I'll tell you everything, Sophie said, and meant it. The portable hearth spell was in a box under Michael's workbench, wrapped in cloth. It was a glass bowl, thicker than ordinary glass, with a faint opalescent shimmer that meant it had been blown with magic in the mix, fitted with a metal frame and 2 handles, like a very odd soup tureen. The enchantment sustained a fire demon's flame for approximately 1 hour outside a fixed hearth, which Michael had calculated through a series of experiments that had involved Calcifer, a stopwatch, 3 failed attempts, 1 singed eyebrow, Michael's, and a good deal of complaining, Calcifer's. Calcifer settled into the bowl with the fussy care of a person getting into a bath they weren't sure about the temperature of. His flames compressed, flickered, steadied. He burned smaller than usual, about the size of a large candle flame, but his blue face was clear, his eyes bright. If anyone asks, he said, I am doing this under protest. Noted. Sophie lifted the bowl by both handles. It was warm but not hot, the spell insulated nicely. She tucked a folded blanket over the top to keep the wind off, leaving an opening for air and for Calcifer to see out. Ready? I was born ready. I was a falling star. I was the most spectacular thing in the sky for 9 seconds. I am absolutely ready to be carried in a bowl down a country road to look at a farmer's field. Good, Sophie said, ignoring the sarcasm with the ease of long practice, and they went out the door. The Port Haven road ran east out of Market Chipping, past the last of the terraced houses and the smithy and the goat field where Mr. Henderson's goats stood in a suspicious cluster that suggested they were planning something. January had settled into the grudging phase of winter where everything was brown and grey and damp and the sky looked like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. The road was mud. Sophie's boots were good ones. She'd learned about boots during the long walk into the waste years ago and had never skimped on footwear since. But the mud sucked at her soles with every step as though the road was trying to keep her. I'd forgotten about wind, Calcifer said from the bowl. His voice was muffled by the blanket. Is it always this horizontal? It's barely blowing. It That's touching me. Wind is touching my flames. That's extremely personal. You'll survive. They passed the turning to Upper Folding, where a hedge had grown into the precise shape of a Christmas tree and refused to be trimmed back into anything more sensible, one of the milder after-effects of 3 centuries of holiday arriving at once. A pond by the roadside reflected a sky that was a slightly different shade from the actual sky overhead, as though it was showing the weather from a few hours ago, or a few hours hence. 2 sheep on the hillside above were standing perfectly still, facing in opposite directions, in a way that made Sophie suspect they were stuck in one of the minor time loops that had been appearing around Ingary like hiccups in reality. Calcifer was quiet. Sophie noticed this because Calcifer was rarely quiet. He was a creature of crackle and comment, of sardonic observation and thermal complaint. But for a stretch of the road, as the muddy lane crested a hill and the valley opened up below them in a sweep of brown fields and distant grey hills under that wrung-out sky, Calcifer went still. Sophie looked down. Through the gap in the blanket she could see his flame, and it had changed colour. Not his usual blue-green, and not the orange of annoyance or the yellow of contentment. Something softer. A pale, shifting white gold like candlelight. Or like... She searched for the comparison and found it. Like starlight seen from below. From the ground. He was looking up. Not at Sophie, not at the road, not at anything in front of them. He was looking at the sky. The grey, flat, unremarkable January sky of Ingary, which had nothing in it worth looking at. No stars, no moon, just thick cloud. And Calcifer was staring at it with an expression on his small blue face that Sophie had never seen before. She couldn't name it. It wasn't longing, exactly. It wasn't happiness. It was something older and stranger, the look of someone revisiting a place they left a long time ago and finding it both smaller and larger than they remembered. She didn't say anything. She kept walking. After a while, Calcifer's flames shifted back to their usual blue, and he said, in a voice that was almost but not quite his normal sardonic tone, "The sky is very far away." "Yes," Sophie said. "I knew that, obviously. You can see it from the chimney. But from down here..." He stopped. "It's different from down here." "Yes. Don't agree with me. It's unsettling." Sophie smiled and said nothing, and they walked on. Stump End was a hamlet in the way that a collection of 5 houses, a stone barn and a shared well constituted a hamlet, which was to say, barely. It sat in a fold of the hills where 2 valleys met, surrounded by sheep-cropped pasture, and bounded by dry stone walls that looked as though they'd been there since before anyone thought to call the place a name. There was no shop, no chapel, no pub. There was a horse trough at the crossroads. Sophie recognized it from the letter, and a wooden signpost with one arm that said Market Chipping, 2 hours, and another that said Porthaven and a third, pointing at the ground, that said Stump End, as though the place were ashamed of itself. Amos Cotter's farm was the second on the left, distinguished from the first by a gate that actually closed and a yard that, despite the season, was ruthlessly tidy. Everything in it had been put where it belonged and seemed to know it. Tools hung on the barn wall in order of size. The woodpile was stacked with the precision of masonry. Even the chickens, who were pecking around the yard in the desultory way chickens have, seemed to be doing so in neat rows. The man who came to the gate was about 55, weather-beaten in the way that hills make people weather-beaten, not damaged, just shaped, like a stone worn smooth by decades of the same wind. He had thick hands, a cropped grey head, and the wary expression of someone who had written a letter to a castle in a moment of weakness and was now regretting it. "Mr. Cotter," Sophie said. "Aye." He looked at her. He looked at the glass bowl she was carrying. He looked at the small blue flame burning inside it. He looked back at her. "You're not the wizard." "I'm his wife, Sophie Hatter." "Sophie Pendragon, technically," Calcifer said from the bowl. "Or Sophie Jenkins if you ask the Welsh side of the family, which nobody does because..." Thank you, Calcifer. Amos Cotter stared at the bowl. That's a fire. In a bowl, talking. He's a fire demon. He's with me. I'm not with her. I'm an independent entity being transported under protest for purposes of field reconnaissance. Amos looked at Sophie with the expression of a man clinging to the last shreds of his conviction that the world made sense. You'd better come in, he said. Marjorie's put the kettle on. Marjorie Cotter was a square, solid woman with iron-grey hair pinned under a cap, and the manner of someone who had been running a household for 30 years and would continue to do so whether magic existed or not. She produced tea without being asked, set out shortbread on a plate, and then retired to the kitchen doorway where she stood with folded arms and an expression that said very clearly, I will observe. I will reserve judgment. This had better be good. The farmhouse kitchen was spotless and plain, whitewashed walls, a flagstone floor, a scrubbed table, no dried herbs, no embroidered cushions, no touches of personality, or rather the absence of decoration was itself a kind of statement. This was a house that valued order, things in their place. Right, Amos said, sitting opposite Sophie with his mug of tea held in both hands like a shield. I'll show you the field, but first I want to be clear. I'm not mad, I'm not making it up, and I don't want publicity. Hanson next door already thinks I'm putting it on for attention, and the man from the Agricultural Society sent a letter suggesting unusual soil subsidence that I know for a fact he copied from a pamphlet because I've read the same pamphlet and it doesn't mention fence posts that move 10 feet east. Tell me what's been happening, Sophie said. Start from the beginning. Started after Christmas. He said Christmas with the uncomfortable emphasis of a man who remembered the 3 centuries at once restoration as a particularly vivid and unexplained weekend. The big south field, 10 acres, good soil, winter wheat on the south slope, turnips on the north, drainage ditch running east-west along the lower boundary. I've farmed it 32 years, knew every inch of it before my father died, and I know it better now. And on December 28th, I went out to check the wheat, and the wheat wasn't where I'd put it. Where was it? North slope. Where the turnips were. Turnips had moved to the south. Clean swap, no damage, no torn roots, no disturbance to the soil, like someone had picked up the entire planting and set it down somewhere else. Overnight. He took a long drink of tea. I told myself I was confused. I wasn't. I've farmed that field since I was 23. I know where I plant things. It happened again. Every few nights. The furrows shifted direction. They used to run north-south. Now they follow the hillside contour. 3 fence posts moved. The drainage ditch is 6 feet further south than it was in November, right at the lowest point of the slope, which is... He stopped. His jaw worked. Which is where I've always wanted it. But I never moved it because the labor would have taken 2 men and a week. And now it's just... there. Sophie set down her tea. I want to see the field, Mr. Cotter. Aye. He stood. I thought you might. The south field was behind the barn, through a gate, down a gentle slope to where the land opened into a wide, tilted expanse of winter farmland. The sky was low and grey above it. The soil was dark and wet from the recent rains. It looked, at first glance, like any other field in the hill country, unremarkable, dormant, waiting for spring. Except that the fox charm on Sophie's wrist was burning. Not the warm pulse of the cottage, something different, thinner, more spread out, like heat rising from sun-warmed rock. The smell that came with it wasn't bread and lavender. It was earth, deep, loamy, rain-soaked earth, and underneath that, something green. Not the green of things growing, but the green of intention. The potential for growth, stored and waiting. Calcifer, Sophie said quietly. Are you getting this? Oh, yes. His voice from the bowl had lost its sardonic edge. He sounded alert, focused, the way he sounded when he was tracking a spell's structure. It's warm, not temperature warm. Magically warm. Like the cottage, but... He paused, flame flickering. Different. The cottage was concentrated. A building, 50 years of love in a small space. This is spread across the whole field. Thinner, but it's the same kind of magic. Domestic. Accumulated. Someone has been pouring themselves into this land for a very long time. Sophie looked at Amos. He was standing at the gate, watching them with his arms folded, the posture of a man waiting for a verdict he already suspects he won't like. "Mr. Cotter," she said, "do you talk to the field?" He blinked. "What?" "Do you talk to the land, to the soil, the crops, when you're out here working?" His face closed. "I'm not daft." "I didn't say you were." "Everyone talks to their land. Every farmer from here to Port Haven. You go out in the morning and you say, 'Come on then to the wheat and rain off to the sky,' and hold, you bugger to the drainage when it floods. It doesn't mean anything. It's just what you do." "Sometimes," Sophie said, "it means something." She stepped through the gate and walked into the field. Her boots sank into the dark soil, cold and wet through the leather. She crouched down and put her hand flat on the earth. It was nothing like the cottage. The cottage had been a person, almost. A distinct presence, warm and grieving and capable of something like conversation. The field was not a person. It was more like weather, or like a current in a river, a vast, slow, impersonal movement of magic through the soil, following patterns it didn't understand because understanding wasn't part of its nature. It didn't think. It didn't feel, not the way the cottage felt. It just moved, rearranging itself according to an organizing principle that was embedded so deeply in the land it might as well have been geology. But the organizing principle, Sophie could feel it now, her palm flat in the mud, the fox charm buzzing so hard it hurt. The organizing principle was Amos. 32 years of walking these 10 acres. 32 years of looking at the drainage and thinking that should be 6 feet south. 32 years of knowing in the bone-deep way that farmers know exactly how the land should lie, where the wheat would do best, which direction the furrows should follow, where water pooled and where it drained. He'd never had the time or the labor to reshape the field to match the perfect version in his head. But every day, every pass across the soil, every muttered instruction and casual encouragement, he'd been laying it down like paint. Layer after layer after layer, until the Christmas magic blew through and woke it all up, and the field started doing what Amos had always known it should. "It's not the field," Sophie said, standing up. Her knees were muddy and her hand was freezing, and she didn't care. She turned to Amos. "The magic isn't in the field, it's in you." The silence that followed had a quality like the moment after you drop something fragile. The held breath before you look down to see if it's broken. "No," Amos said. "Yes. I don't have." He looked at her the way a sensible person looks at someone who has just told them the floor isn't solid. "I'm a farmer. I'm not magical. Nobody in my family has ever been magical. My father farmed this land and his father before him, and none of them were." "Mr. Cotter." Sophie's voice was blunt. Not unkind, but blunt in the way she was when there was a truth that needed saying and no gentle way to say it. "I spent 19 years sewing hats in a shop in Market Chipping without knowing I was talking life into every one of them. I put so much magic into a walking stick once that it turned into a wand. I enchanted a scarecrow by accident. I know what it looks like when someone has power they don't know about, because I was someone with power I didn't know about, and I can tell you it looks exactly like this." Amos stared at her. His jaw was tight. His hands, at his sides, had clenched into fists. Not aggressive, just held. Held in the way of a man gripping something he's afraid of dropping. "The field," he said slowly. "The field is doing what you've always wanted it to do, what you've known it should do for 30 years. The drainage, the crop rotation, the furrow direction, all of it came from you, your knowledge, your care, your attention. The Christmas magic. Just turn the volume up. Can you turn it back down? Sophie hesitated. This was the part she didn't have a good answer for. With the cottage, the answer had been straightforward. The house needed company, and company could be arranged. A field wasn't a house. And Amos wasn't dead. The magic was active, coming from a living person. She couldn't just talk it into settling down because the source was standing right in front of her looking like he'd been hit by a cart. No, she said honestly. I can't undo it. It's yours. It's been building for decades and the Christmas overflow activated it, and it's not going back to sleep. From the bowl, Calcifer spoke. For what it's worth, the field's improvements are genuinely good. The drainage relocation is optimal. The crop positions make more sense with the soil composition and sun exposure. If you'd hired the best agricultural planner in Ingary to redesign this field from scratch, they'd have come up with more or less what your magic already did. Amos looked at the fire demon. Is that supposed to make me feel better? I have no opinion on your feelings. I'm a fire demon. I'm commenting on the field. From up by the farmhouse, Marjorie Cotter had emerged onto the step. She'd been watching from the kitchen window and had apparently decided that events required her closer attention. She walked down the slope to the gate with the measured stride of a woman who would arrive at her own pace, thank you, and stopped beside her husband. Well, she said. Apparently I'm a witch, Amos said, in a flat tone that could have been shock or fury or some uniquely agricultural combination of both. Marjorie looked at Sophie. Sophie braced herself for indignation, denial, or the sort of sensible skepticism that Amos's letter had implied his wife specialized in. That explains the carrots, Marjorie said. Everyone stared at her. In 1993, Marjorie said. Sophie did a quick mental conversion. Ingary's calendar didn't quite match Wales's, but the year would have been about 12 seasons ago. Amos was in a temper about the carrot crop, slugs. He stood in this field and told the carrots that if they couldn't defend themselves from slugs, they weren't worth growing. The next morning, every carrot in the field had grown a small, hard nodule at the base, like a fist. She looked at her husband. The slugs never came back. I told you it was strange. You said it was a hardy variety. It was a hardy variety. It was you, Amos. It was you telling them to toughen up and them doing it. She turned to Sophie. Can you teach him? To control it? Because the field improving itself I can live with. But last week the chicken coop moved 3 feet to the left and my best laying hen hasn't been right since. Sophie almost laughed, not at Marjorie, at the recognition. This was exactly what it was like. You found out someone you loved was magical, and your first thought wasn't wonder or fear. It was, can we please stop the furniture moving? I can't teach him, Sophie said. I'm still learning myself. But I can write to Mrs. Fairfax in upper folding. She trains hedge witches, and she'll know how to work with someone whose magic comes out through, well, agricultural intervention. And I'll write to you, Mr. Cotter. I'll check in. You're not the first person this has happened to, and I suspect you won't be the last. Not the first, Amos said. There's a cottage in Market Chipping that walked 2 valleys to find my front door because an old woman spent 50 years loving it into life without knowing what she was doing. Sophie met his eyes. You're not alone in this, and it's not a curse. It's just you, a part of you that's been there all along. Amos looked out at his field. The winter wheat on the north slope, where his magic had moved it, was, Sophie noticed, looking healthier than winter wheat had any right to look in late January. The furrows following the hill's natural contour gave the field a fluid, organic appearance, as though it had grown that way instead of being ploughed. It is a better layout, he admitted grudgingly in the tone of a man conceding a point he would rather have died than concede. I was going to restructure the drainage in spring. Would have taken a fortnight. Took 1 night, Calcifer said. Nobody asked you. just noting the efficiency. Marjorie poured Sophie more tea from a pot she had apparently carried down to the field, because she was the sort of woman who believed tea was appropriate in all settings and was, in Sophie's opinion, entirely correct. They stood in the thin January sunlight, or the memory of sunlight since the clouds hadn't really broken, and drank tea and looked at the field that had rearranged itself into the shape of one man's 30-year understanding of the land, and it was strange and unsettling, and also, in a way that Sophie felt in her chest, rather beautiful. "The fox charm," Calcifer said quietly, as Sophie was finishing her tea. His voice was low enough that only she could hear, the cotters having retreated a few steps to argue about the chicken coop. "It's been warm since we got here. What does it smell like?" Sophie closed her eyes, reached for the fox charm's scents, the smell of possibility, the scent of things that could be. The cottage had smelled of bread and earth and home. This field smelled different, green, sharp, alive, like sap rising, like the first breath of spring buried under layers of winter soil, and underneath, something she couldn't quite identify, a sound more than a scent, a low hum, as though the land itself was vibrating at a frequency just below hearing. "Growth," she said, "impatient growth, and something else, something I can't. The whole valley is like this," Calcifer said. His flames had gone pale again, the way they had on the hilltop. "Not just this field. The field is the strongest point because Amos has been concentrated here, but the magic is bleeding into the surrounding land. The hedgerows, the pasture, even the stones in the wall." A pause. "This is going to get more complicated, Sophie. Not less." "I know. There are going to be more letters." "I know." They left Stumpend an hour later after Sophie had written down Mrs. Fairfax's address for Amos, given Marjorie a list of signs to watch for. "If the barn starts rearranging itself, don't panic. If the animals start talking, write to me immediately." And promised to return in 2 weeks. Amos walked them to the horse trough at the crossroads and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking not at Sophie but at the hills, the grey sky, the familiar landscape of a life that had just been fundamentally reclassified. "Mrs. Hatter," he said, as she turned to go. "Sophie. Sophie." He shifted his weight. "The field, the new layout. Should I leave it, or try to put it back?" "Leave it," Sophie said. "It's better this way. You knew that before I told you." He nodded once and went back through his gate. The walk home was quieter. The January afternoon was fading early, the way it did in the short days, the light going pewter and then grey and then the soft bluish dark of a winter evening coming in from the east. Sophie's boots were heavy with mud. The glass bowl was warm in her hands. Calcifer had been quiet since they'd left Stumpend, not sleeping, not sulking, just quiet in the way of someone who has seen something they need to think about. "Calcifer," Sophie said as they crested the hill above Market Chipping and saw the lights of the town below, the castle's windows glowing amber, the cottage's chimney trailing its inexplicable smoke, the distant warm squares of Martha's bakery and the slightly purple gleam of the pudding cooperative. "On the road this morning, when you looked at the sky." "I don't want to talk about it." "All right." "I'm a fire demon. We don't do—" He made a frustrated sound that came out as a crackle of sparks. "The sky is where I was, before I fell, before Howl, before all of this." A long pause. His flame guttered and steadied. "I don't miss it. I chose the hearth. I choose it every day. But being under it again, after all this time, without being in a crisis or an emergency or running from something, just being there, in the open, with nothing between me and where I started." He stopped. Sophie waited. "It's very large," he said finally. "The sky, it's larger than I remembered. You can go outside again, whenever you want. The spell has no limit on how often." "I know that. I'm just saying." "I know." His flames brightened. deliberately, the way Calcifer brightened when he was pulling himself together and daring anyone to comment. "Don't make it a thing, Sophie. I went outside, I looked at the sky. The sky was large, that's all." "That's all," Sophie agreed, and carried him home. The castle, when they arrived, had rearranged itself again. The kitchen table was back where it belonged, but the chairs had migrated to the living room, and the living room chairs had ended up in the conservatory where the starlight orchids were weaving around them possessively, as though they'd always wanted furniture and were thrilled by the delivery. The bathroom had stopped humming the sea shanty and had moved on to something that sounded, horribly, like a lullaby. The front door opened smoothly to market chipping without complaint, which Sophie found more unsettling than the resistance because it felt performative, like a person being pointedly, aggressively normal. "The castle moved the chairs while you were gone," Calcifer reported, settling back into his hearth with an audible sigh of relief and stretching his flames to fill the grate. "And it tried to close the conservatory door on Sage, who was visiting to discuss root ethics with the cottage, and it rattled its own shutters for 20 minutes after you left, which I know because I counted." Sophie stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the ceiling. The castle creaked. Not the random creak of an old building settling, but a specific, deliberate creak, the kind of sound a house makes when it wants you to know it noticed you were gone. "We'll talk about this later," Sophie told it, and was not entirely surprised when a pipe in the wall let out a noise that sounded remarkably like a sniff. Morgan was asleep in his cot, Midnight curled beside him with 3 eyes open and 3 eyes dreaming. Howl was still in Kingsbury. He'd sent a note via Michael saying he'd be back tomorrow, something about the time paradoxes requiring proper documentation, which means politics, which means at least 3 shirts. Sophie ate a cold supper at the displaced kitchen table and did not think about patterns or dormant magic, or how many people in Ingary might be discovering right now that the world was larger and stranger than they'd ever suspected. Then she cleared the plates and pulled the letter pile toward her. Not the possible pile, not the unlikely pile, not the completely mad pile, all of them. Every letter that had arrived in the past 3 weeks, from farmers and shopkeepers and school teachers and lonely people in small towns who had written to a building because they didn't know who else to ask. She picked up a pen. She pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. She thought for a moment, and then she wrote, "Dear Mrs. Clearwater, thank you for your letter about the singing well. I would like to hear more about when it started and what it sings. If convenient, I will visit Porthaven in the coming weeks. In the meantime, please do not pour anything into the well to make it stop. It may be singing for a reason. Sincerely, Sophie Hatter." She looked at the letter. It was short. It was direct. It didn't promise anything she couldn't deliver. She folded it, wrote the address on the front, and set it aside. Then she picked up the next letter and the one after that. She didn't answer all of them. The Starlight Orchid Baldness Cure inquiries went back in the unlikely pile, and the man who wanted a tour got a polite refusal. But she answered 12 before the candle burned low. 12 letters to 12 strangers, each one careful and honest and free of promises, each one ending with the same thing. "I will look into this. You are not imagining it. You are not alone." Calcifer watched her from the hearth. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything. He just burned, steady and blue, the way he always did when Sophie was doing the thing she was always going to do. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe hummed. Somewhere upstairs, the bathroom creaked. Outside, in the dark, Keeper's cottage breathed its slow, patient breath, and the witch's roses climbed another inch up the east wall, and the sentient pudding cooperative closed its shutters for the night. And market chipping went on being the kind of town where magic happened whether you wanted it to or not, and the letters sat in their piles, waiting. Sophie sealed the 12th envelope and put down her pen. Her hands smelled of ink and mud and, faintly, of earth after rain.